Ah, the 1980s, when prog rock tried to reinvent itself and promptly tripped over its own capes. That aside, today I'm looking at 9 albums that didn't just flop, they got obliterated. Some of these albums didn't just die, they practically left a crater. Now, for those of you who really aren't prog fanatics, here's the essential context. Prog rock is complex, it's long, often weird music. It's the antithesis of shiny, radio-friendly 80s. But the bands had mortgages and record labels breathing down their necks, so they had to try and adapt. Now, I'll pick some of the biggest, perhaps most embarrassing messes, based on commercial failure and brutal critical reception from the biggest names in journalism. Now, before you all start to stick pins in doll-like effigies of yours truly, this video has been composed from the angle of the critical reception. It doesn't necessarily reflect my thoughts. But I'm starting with one of the greats, Jethro Tull and their 1984 album, Under Wraps. Their main man, Ian Anderson, was known for his flute and his acoustic whimsy. So how did he adapt to the 1980s? Well, by ditching the band and perhaps using a drum machine and synthesizers. It's basically Ian Anderson singing political spy thrillers over very sterile 80s production. The fans simply hated the mechanical sound, and the critics were absolutely savage. There was a review in AllMusic, and this said the album was a misguided foray into electronic pop that was embarrassingly weak. Commercially, it peaked at number 76 in the US. Now, for a band that's used to get top 10 hits, this is a spectacular flop. The failure was so complete, it gave Ian Anderson chronic tinnitus and forced Tull to take a 3-year break. Yes, had a massive hit in '83 with 90125 and Owner of a Lonely Heart. But their follow-up, Big Generator, was the sound of a band falling apart under the pressure to repeat that success. Now, if I'm honest, I never take any satisfaction in highlighting a favourite band of mine's failure to deliver. But for this one, they'd spent basically 2 years in the studio fighting over every synth patch and guitar riff. It did go gold, of course, but it was seen as a huge failure for a band of Yes's stature. The real damage, though, was in the critical reception. Rolling Stone described it as bombastic and hollow, and an attempt to create something grand, whilst forgetting to deliver the music. Ow! It was the sound of two competing visions, the pop sound and the prog sound, and essentially they cancelled each other out. After this, singer John Anderson quit the band again. Canadian rockers Rush didn't totally flop in the 80s, but they definitely had a commercial low point. Their 1987 album, Hold Your Fire, however, is it. This album saw them dive headfirst into the land of Fairlight synthesizer. Geddy Lee's keyboards became really the dominant instrument, often crowding out the incredible guitar work of Alex Lifeson. Can you imagine that? The result? Well, it was their first album in 7 years not to go platinum, this halting their long commercial peak. The critical reviews were equally tepid too. The Chicago Tribune noted that they had submerged their instrumental dexterity, and that the album was too synthetic and too stiff. Even their great lyricist Neil Peart later called this era a creative dead end. Now, the next example is of prog royalty in the shape of ELP, attempting what was considered a resurrection. But here's the problem. It wasn't exactly ELP. It was Keith Emerson and bassist Greg Lake, yes, but they teamed up with session drummer Cozy Powell, hence the name Emerson, Lake and Powell. Now, they were clearly chasing the stadium rock sounds of bands like perhaps Foreigner. Now, in 1986, they released a self-titled effort, but the music was more glossy, compressed, and simple with no signs of the complex virtuosity that really had made them so famous. It was an epic commercial failure, picking at number 35 in the US, and really was considered an embarrassment by the band members themselves. Kerrang magazine brutally summed it up. Just another polished AOR record, adding that prog rock visibly died a slow, agonizing death. This was the sound of a band giving up their identity for a hit that really just never came. Next, I've got a little bit of a cheat here because the 1983 album Mike Oldfield released, Crisis, was a massive worldwide hit because of the song Moonlight Shadow. Remember that one? But Oldfield's true progressive rock fanbase hated it, and it was his attempt to pivot completely to the pop world. And the follow-up singles and some of the album tracks were considered absolute flops. Now, the first side was pretty decent, and with Shadow on the Wall featuring Roger Chapman's vocals and John Anderson singing on In High Places, there's really a good tracks in my humble opinion. But it was that critical reception again to the idea of Oldfield's change in approach that really muddied the waters. Melody Maker lamented, "Gone are the days of Tubular Bells," saying that Oldfield now aims squarely at the charts, with songs that are as disposable as Kleenex. Brutal. The prog faithful felt betrayed by the electronic drums and simple song structures. It was a commercial success, but it utterly failed at its original mission and target audience. Then there was Kansas, those masters of American progressive rock, who got truly desperate here with the 1983 release Drastic Measures. Now, once the previous album Vinyl Confessions had been released in 1982, tensions were building within the band. Christian themes were becoming more prevalent, and this had caused Robbie Steinhardt to leave as a result. Lead singer John Elefante had the majority of ideas, which meant that this time Kerry Livgren wrote just 3 of the tracks on this record. Now, the album turned out to be a masterclass in generic 80s production. It completely jettisoned the violins, the mythology, and that grandeur that the band possessed. Commercially, it was a disaster, selling barely 300,000 copies, which was a fraction of their previous album sales. The band disintegrated shortly afterwards. Sputnik Music later called it a monumental misstep that sold their soul for a quick buck. It was the album that officially killed the original Kansas lineup. Now, Asia were a supergroup made up of members of Yes, ELP and King Crimson. Their first album was a monster hit, but it was their third release, Astra, that really marked the end of the band. John Wetton had left after the second album due to issues with alcohol, but he'd returned for this one on the understanding that Steve Howe was to be replaced, as they clearly didn't get on. What happened? Mandy Mayer replaced Howe, with all the album's mission being simple: more radio hits. But the critics didn't buy it. The New York Times review was particularly savage, which had generally been positive of their initial work, but they said of Astra, it was synthetic and emotionally empty, adding that the compositions were simplistic and lacked the dramatic flair of their early work. It peaked at number 67 in the US, and the band basically fell apart right after the tour, with their record company, Geffen, being blamed for a lack of promotion for the album. Gentle Giant were one of the most intellectually complex prog bands in history, but their 1980 album, Civilian, was a desperate final act. After a decade of composing intricate, medieval-inspired, utterly unique music, they tried to make a slick, fast, commercial, viable album. The trouble was, it was too late. The fans saw it as a sellout, and the mainstream just never really cared. Civilian peaked at number 203 on the US charts and was almost completely ignored. A devastating review in Record Collector described the album as a sad, pale imitation of their former glory and a surrender to American AOR mediocrity. The band dissolved pretty much immediately after its release, making Civilian, sadly, the musical obituary for one of Prog's true innovators. Let's end this one with a band that were really always very much respected, but never a commercial monster. We're talking about Camel here. Now, they were known for their lush instrumental concept albums, and they decided to tackle a very dark, somber concept about the separation caused by the Berlin Wall with their 1984 release Stationary Traveller. This was a peak prog rock theme, but it was delivered with all the cold, brittle sound of the mid-80s. The music is undeniably beautiful, but is intensely bleak, featuring very few of the grand guitar solos and melodic hooks the band were really known for. It was a total commercial non-starter, and the critics found the concept too heavy-handed. Sounds magazine noted that the album was as grey and unforgiving as the wall itself, but they did manage to add that it was an album for the head, not for the feet, effectively saying, this really isn't fun 80s music. The flop caused the band to fracture, leaving main man Andy Latimer completely disheartened, and it was a full 7 years before Camel released another studio album. It's a true progressive flop. So there you have it. 9 albums, really from legendary artists that were commercially and critically utterly pulverized by the 1980s and the critics, and proved to be memorable flops. So what's the real lesson here? Well, the prog rock bands that survived the 80s, bands like Genesis and perhaps a pre-Big Generator Yes, they did so by being decisive in their change. Rightly or wrongly, they went all in on the pop sound. The bands on this list failed because they really dithered. They tried to compromise. They threw a drum machine on an 8-minute epic. Or they made a 3-minute pop song, but kept the 15-minute concept album pretension, and really suffered at the hands of the critics, which is really what this whole video is all about. They made music that was considered too simple for the old fans, but too complex and weird for the new ones. These albums have become a time capsule of a genre that was desperately trying to fit into a decade that fundamentally rejected everything it stood for. They are the sound of great musicians sacrificing their identity in failed attempts at commercial relevance. Now, you don't have to be a prog fan to appreciate a good train wreck, and that's why these albums are so fascinating. I am genuinely curious, which of these album flops have you heard? Did the critics get it wrong? Is there one of these that you actually love? And perhaps more importantly, have I missed any of the bigger prog flops from this decade? There were so many, but I had to narrow it down to what I believe were perhaps the most spectacular failures. But let me know in the comments if you will. And if you've enjoyed this look at the musical failure and critical snark, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into rock history, and also ring that bell so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep listening, keep exploring, and remember, in the world of prog, the journey never really ends.